US is pushing hard for a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, but what could that really mean? This is Macro Matters, and we're talking about Ukraine. US envoy Steve Witkoff is expected to travel to Moscow next week for further talks on a possible peace plan after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he was ready to advance a framework for ending the war. European allies have been trying to push back against a 28-point plan drafted by the US, apparently with Russian input. That would involve a cap on the size of the Ukrainian army and force the country to give up territory it still controls. Holger Schmeiding is chief economist at Berenberg. Holger, what would such a deal mean on the macro level for Europe?
Well, first of all, it's good that we have a determined push to end the war. I'm doubtful that it actually will be a success. Well, an end to this war for Europe would, of course, to some extent be good news as long as it's on terms acceptable to Europe and Ukraine. But the macroeconomic impact on Europe would be very limited. Why? We are sort of used to this ongoing war now. We would, if the war was over, still have to ramp up our defense spending because Putin would still be there. Putin would be a threat to us in Europe, possibly even more so if he's no longer tied up in Ukraine. So beyond a little near-term confidence effect, war is over on acceptable terms. Probably the impact would be small.
Well, as you say, the huge push for rearmament this year has allowed Germany to break long-standing borrowing limits and boosted the European defence industry. Do you expect that a deal like this that gives Russia more of its maximalist demands force Europe to spend even more on its own defence?
Yes, that's a very good summary. In markets, there is the typical knee-jerk reaction, end to war, headlines about that being possible, and defence stocks in Europe sell off, which I think is exactly the wrong reaction. Because if the war ends on terms where Putin can claim and feel he is half victorious, he would then be even more of a threat to Europe than before. Only an end to the war where Putin really does not get away with blatant aggression would be something which would make Europe safer and thus be a reason to spend a bit less on the defense build-up. But unfortunately, such a resolution for the time being looks fairly unlikely.
Can Europe finance a rebuilding of Ukraine? Would large US investors, perhaps those interested in Ukraine's mineral resources, have to be tapped in any post-war reconstruction?
Well, Europe can certainly finance it. First of all, when it comes to public money, well, yes, we do have constraints, but our public finances are in better order than those of the US. So at least theoretically speaking, we could. Also, our domestic companies would have at least some facilities to help in Ukraine. And I think as to the exploitation of Ukrainian minerals, that's largely a Ukrainian decision, whether they want to work mostly with the US or whether they want to work more with Europe. After all, Ukraine is hopefully on the way to join the European Union's internal market in a little while, and that would argue for a strong European component in working on the Ukrainian minerals.
What about the role of Russia if the US were to drop sanctions? Can Russian oil and gas return to Europe's energy markets?
I don't think it would return in huge numbers for one simple reason. Every money that we pay Russia for more energy is money that Putin could use to feed his military machine. And we would have to guard against that. On our side, paying soldiers, paying for more weapons is far more expensive than it is in Russia. Roughly speaking, for every extra euro that Putin may get, if we import Russian gas and oil in bigger numbers, for every euro, we would have to put 2 euros into our defense. So that is a lose situation for us. I, as a result, do not think that Berlin, Germany, will once again make the mistake of opening the Nord Stream pipelines against the objections of Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltics. Russia has shattered trust for good, and Europe, possibly unlike some US businesses, but Europe will not return large scale to do business with Russia as long as Putin or someone of his ilk is in power over there.
How badly does Russia need those sanctions dropped at the moment? Can Putin finance his military machine, or could lack of money push Moscow to the negotiating table?
Russia is facing a lack of money that is partly sanctions which are working as a slow poison, making it more expensive for Russia to import the things it wants and needs for the military machine. Also, oil prices, global energy prices are lower than they were a year ago. that is also draining resources from Russia. In addition, Russia has an inflation problem, high interest rates. All that means Russia now has to raise taxes to finance the war, which is not very popular. The Russian economic situation is not desperate, but the economy on the Russian side is weakening, which is an argument for Putin, hopefully, to eventually come to the negotiating table with not just his current maximalist intentions, but the more pressure we can put on Russia, the earlier this moment may come that Putin sees, let's better have an armistice rather than continue this costly and to some extent not very popular war.
That was Holger Schmeiding of Berenberg. Don't forget you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.